I hope you're aware of who he is, the American Minute radio series. He's a historian, an author, you might look at all those books in the back, a former evangelical pastor. The man has also run for Congress before. He was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, the fifth of 11 children. I'm sure there are a lot of stories with that. Graduated from St. Louis University, 1980, with a degree in accounting and business administration. He hosts a daily program called Faith in History. This man has appeared on all sorts of news outlets such as C-SPAN, Fox, Hannity and Combs, The O'Reilly Factor, MSNBC, ABC, and all sorts of other programs. Thank you so much. Please help me welcome Mr. Bill Federer.
Well, it is great to be with you, and I am very impressed with all that's going on right here. I'm going to have a PowerPoint presentation that I do a daily radio spot, as Cindy mentioned, and it's called American Minute, and then I also do a daily TV program called Faith in History, and it airs on the Direct TV on channel 377 if you get that. If not, you can go to my website, AmericanMinute.com, and click on the little Faith in History link, and you can watch several dozen shows right there online. And my wife has heard me speak for 30 years, and so she decided she was going to pick out the best stories. And so these are stories where our country faced an enormous crisis, whether it's the French and Indian War, Revolution, War of 1812, Civil War, and we had leaders that called us to pray and even fast and pray, and then we had men and women with faith and courage, and things turned around. And so we put it together in a book called Miracles in American History. And can you see this okay? Is the lighting all right? And I'm just gonna give a little background here. So we'll back up in time, and in the Middle Ages, all of Europe was Catholic, and then you had the invasion of Islam. And so Islam conquers Egypt, which used to be Christian. People forget that Egypt was evangelized by Mark, that wrote the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, until Amir ibn Alas invaded. And then Jerusalem had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine. It was Christian for 3 centuries until Caliph Umar conquered it. And then Syria was the first country to completely be Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. And Antioch, Syria, is where the name Christian was invented. And the Christian Syrians evangelized into Persia, Iran, Babylon, into Mongolia, into China during the Tang Dynasty in the 600s through the Yuan Dynasty in the 1300s. The Syrian Christians were to the east what the Greek and Roman Christians were to the west. So there's more Christian writing in the Syrian language of Syriac than any other languages other than Greek and Latin, until Caliph Umar conquered Syria. And then there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa in the 7th century. And they were all wiped out in one generation by Muslims. Matter of fact, the Christians at the time had adopted their version of separation of church and state. It was a hyper-pietism, where if you became a Christian and you were sincere about it, you were expected to give away your money and live in a cave, or beg on the streets, or build a platform in the desert and bake in the sun, thinking that you're, burning off your sins and becoming holier. But it was this idea that if you're a Christian, you should stop impacting the culture, and you should take yourself out of the culture and just sort of isolate yourself. And what happened was the Christians had done that, and so Islam, in just one generation, bowled right through North Africa and wiped out all the Christian there. So 250 Catholic dioceses, all gone, just like that. And then the Muslims invaded Spain in the year 711. And so Muhammad dies in the year 632. By the year 732, the Muslims are outside of Paris. And Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, is able to stop them at the Battle of Tours. And if Charles Martel had not been successful, we would be speaking Arabic right now. because German, French, and English would have never developed as languages. We'd be like Egypt, where they cut the tongues out of anybody caught speaking Coptic, and that's how they speak Arabic in Egypt rather than Egyptian in Egypt. And then the Muslims invaded what is today Turkey. Back then, it was the Byzantine Christian Empire. So all 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out by Islam. And so this is the world. And in 1529, the Muslim Sultan is named Suleiman the Magnificent. And he controls that whole area that I just showed you. The Mediterranean is his lake. They enslaved over 1 million Europeans. And there were entire Catholic orders in Europe called the Trinitarians. And the head of the order was called the ransomer. And they would collect alms and donations and go under a white flag to North Africa to get your friend back, who was captured from a Greek island or an Italian coast, or one of the pilgrim ships was captured by the Muslims. You knew that, didn't you? Remember Pilgrims Thanksgiving, 1620? In 1625, the Pilgrims had saved up 800 pounds of beaver skins, sent them back to England for trade, and a Turkish man of war captured it in the English Channel, took it to Morocco, and sold the crew into slavery. And around 1630, the Muslims captured an entire Irish village, the stolen village of Baltimore, Ireland, rounded up the whole town, took them to Morocco, sold them into slavery. Around 1637, they captured around 400 from Reykjavik, Iceland, took them to Morocco, sold them into slavery. And so the European countries decided they would pay an annual tribute. So Sweden, Spain, England would pay millions of dollars a year to the Muslim pirates. Finally, when America broke from Britain, America was no longer covered by the British tribute extortion payments. And that's when they began to capture our American ships and demanded tribute. And Thomas Jefferson got fed up with us paying 20% of our federal budget to these pirates as extortion money. And so Jefferson sends in the Marines. That's where we get the Marine anthem, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Anyway, back to Suleiman the Magnificent. In the year 1529, he has 100,000 Muslim Ottoman Turk warriors surrounding Vienna, Austria. Now that date, 1529, that's 12 years after Martin Luther started the Reformation. And so, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V of Spain, the most powerful man in Western Europe, outside of the Ottoman Empire, and of course India and China are now cut off from the West. Charles V of Spain, from his vantage point, he has a double dilemma. Protestant Reformation on one side and Muslim invasion on the other side. So Charles V decides to strike a deal with these Lutheran Protestants to have a united front against Islam. It's called the Peace of Augsburg of 1555. And this Peace of Augsburg in 1555 had a little Latin phrase that made a big difference. Cuius regio, ius religio, which means whose is the reign, his is the religion. In other words, every king can decide what's going to be believed in his kingdom. Let's just work together against these Muslims that are invading Europe. But this started a domino effect across Europe, where different kings decided to believe different things in their kingdoms. And so we see that northern Germany and Sweden became Lutheran, Switzerland, Calvinist, Scotland, Presbyterian, Holland, Dutch Reformed, Greece was Greek Orthodox, and Spain, Portugal, France, Austria, Italy, Poland remained Roman Catholic, and England was Anglican. And it was one denomination per country. And if you did not believe the way your king did, you were persecuted and you fled. And so there was this mass migration of people shifting around Europe in the 1600s simply for conscience sake. And those were the ones that spilled over and founded colonies in America. So we're picking up to America. Are you still with me? And so Spain had their Spanish Armada sunk in 1588, and this broke Spain's monopoly on the New World. So it was like an Oklahoma land rush. All these European countries began to stake their claims. And so every colony in America was started by a different Christian denomination. So Virginia was Anglican, Massachusetts was Puritan, Rhode Island was Baptist, New York was Dutch Reformed, Delaware and New Jersey were originally Swedish Lutheran, Maryland Catholic, Pennsylvania Quaker, Connecticut and New Hampshire were Congregationalists. You get the picture, one denomination per colony. Their attitude was, if you don't like our denomination, fine, start your own colony. The idea of Christians of different denominations living in the same geographic area was so foreign to them, it took William Penn to do his holy experiment in Pennsylvania and invite them to live in the same area. And Pennsylvania is where the Declaration was written and where the Constitution was written and eventually impacted the rest of the country. I talk about that in these two different books that I wrote. Anyway, in America, we had, prior to the Revolutionary War, a great awakening revival. And what happened was, these denominations, as I mentioned, they did not get along. Do you know the Puritans in Massachusetts not only hung witches, they hung Quakers? 4 Quakers were hung as heretics in Massachusetts. And I could go on and tell you the stories. They'd take someone of another denomination and tar and feather them and, put them on a rail and hoist them up on their shoulders and run them out of town. And so they didn't get along. But when the revolution started, they all had to work together against the King of England. After the revolution, their attitude was, we don't always agree on religion all the time, but you were willing to fight and die for my freedom. I need to let you practice your faith. That's when Christians began to tolerate each other. Wow, what a great experiment. And so we had this great awakening revival that went on in America. And we had the French and Indian War. So the biggest empire in the world was Britain. And the second biggest empire in the world was France. And I wrote a book called Change to Chains. And it's an overview of 6,000 years of world history. And so, just to give you a little nutshell, people say, well, America's the greatest country in the world. I decided to prove it. So I spent about a year researching every civilization that has ever existed on planet Earth. And I found some interesting things. Human records first appear about 3,000 or 4,000 BC. Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley, and Egyptian hieroglyphics on papyrus, where we get the word paper. Well, 3,000 or 4,000 BC, and we're around 2000 AD, so that's 6,000 years. And in a sense, 6,000 years is not that long. It's only 60 people living 100 years each back to back. How many of you have met someone who's lived 100 years or close to it? Right, maybe grandmother. And so we're talking 60 grandmothers, and you're all the way back to the beginning of recorded human history. It's not that long ago. And so question, what is the most common form of government in all of these 6,000 years? Well, let's see. We have pharaohs, Caesars, Kaisers, sultans, czars, Maharaja Genghis Khan, Julius Caesar, Chinese emperors, Aztec Montezumas, King Kamehamehas. It's kings. No matter where you go in the world and no matter which century you pick, you're going to read the history of kings. And I believe it sort of goes back to the fall in the garden and Cain killing Abel and selfishness in the human DNA. And so you put some babies in a playpen, one of them will take the rattle from the others. Put some kids on a playground, one of them is the bully hogging the ball. Drop some people in the woods, one of them is the Indian chief, and drop them in an inner city, one of them is the gang leader. And so it's sort of like the Lord of the Rings. Remember that movie? Everyone wants this ring of power, and if you are friends with the king, you're more equal. If you're not friends with the king, you're less equal. And if you're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason. So for most of world history, equality was how close of an orbit can you get to the king. Sort of interesting. Guess what the first country that we have record of that ruled itself without a king? It's Israel. Israel. About 1500 BC, when Israel comes out of Egypt, where who controlled everything? The Pharaoh. And the children of Israel go into the promised land, and for the first 300 years, they do not have a king. Everyone is equal before the law. And the law says there's no respect of persons in judgment, rich or poor, they're all treated the same. Male, female, made in the image of the Creator. Even the stranger living amongst you is under the same law that you're under. This was revolutionary. I mean, you compare this to Islam, where the stranger living amongst you is a dhimmi, a second-class citizen that has no rights in front of a Sharia court compared to a Muslim. But in Israel, even the stranger living amongst them was under the same law that they were under. Lo and behold, this is the beginning of the very concept of equality on planet Earth. That everyone is equal because everyone, not just our country and our race, but every human being is made in the image of the Creator. Israel had no police or army because everybody was in the police and the army. Everybody was taught the law and everybody enforced it. Israel had no welfare system because the law says to leave the gleanings in your field for the poor people to pick through. And Israel was the first nation with private land ownership. You know all those boring chapters in the Bible where they do surveys and lots and they divide up the land, and you're thinking, boring, you know, this tribe gets from the river to the sea, this tribe gets from the creek to the hill, this tribe, and Caleb's daughter gets married and she gets off the donkey and asks her dad for a wedding present of the spring on the other side of the field, and he says, okay. And my mom's name is Tirzah, and the first mention of Tirzah in the Bible is she was the daughter of Zelophehad, this old guy who had no sons. And so the girls go to Moses and say, are we going to be forgotten? Is our dad's name going to be forgotten? Don't we get land too? And Moses says, okay, you get land, just marry someone within your tribe. But this was unheard of. Individual women getting land, individual families getting land, where in Egypt the Pharaoh controlled it, in the Mesopotamia the kings controlled it, in China the emperors controlled it. Even if you had land in Egypt, it was conditional of you staying on the nice side of the Pharaoh. You cross him, he'll take your land and take your life. But in Israel, there was no king to cross. It was the land permanently titled to the families. This prevented a dictator from getting control of it all and making the people slaves and serfs and peasants the rest of their life. Anyway, Israel's entire system was based on one ingredient: the priests teaching the law. As long as because the pull of human nature was toward a king, and so that they were doing something counter human nature, and so every generation the rabbis had to teach the law. And when they stopped teaching the law and every man did what was right in their own eyes, what happened? It ended up getting, sodomites and killing people, and Eli's son sleeping with women in the tabernacle of meeting. And they finally go to Samuel the prophet and they said, you know what? We want to be like all the other countries. We want a king. And Samuel cries, and the Lord said, they did not reject you, they rejected me. Anyway, I go through history. Athens attempted with a democracy until Alexander the Great's dad conquered them. Rome was a republic for 500 years until Julius Caesar found a way to make himself dictator for life. And you go through history, there were some Italian city-states till Napoleon conquered them. There was Novgorod, a big republic of North Russia, until Ivan the Terrible killed 60,000 of them and incorporated that into Russia. There was an Icelandic Commonwealth until the King of Norway conquered them. There was an English Commonwealth for about 15 years, and then there was America. At the time America was formed, there was not another functioning republic in the world. The world was all kings. You got, the Empress of Russia, Catherine the Great, 12 time zones, all controlled by one person. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, right? He had the Louisiana Territory and French Indonesia and countries in Africa. I mean, you had these kingdoms get bigger and bigger. Genghis Khan killed from Korea to Hungary, killed 30 million people, all controlled by one person. So as time went on, these kingdoms kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, until finally, the biggest empire that planet Earth had ever seen was what? The British Empire. 13 million square miles, 500 million people, all of India, a quarter of the world's population right there. But England was being challenged by the second biggest empire, France. And so they have a war that starts. It's the first world war, but not as we call it. It's the first global war, and it's called the French and Indian War. Or in Europe, it's called the 7 Years' War. And they start fighting in America, and countries in India and over in Indonesia and so forth. So, after the French and Indian War is over, and Britain claims a whole lot of their territory, Britain decides to leave troops on American soil. And there's no barracks. And so the British decide to put their troops in your house. And they would live off of your food. And the people in Boston didn't like this, and so a crowd gathered, and the British fired into the crowd, and it's called the Boston Massacre. And then the King of England started cracking down more. And he would read all their mail, and he would have the Stamp Act, and so it was just sort of like, and so the people get upset with all these taxes because they were being taxed to pay for this occupying army, and so they had the Boston Tea Party. At the same day, the British blockaded Boston's harbor. In Virginia, Thomas Jefferson drafts a day of fasting and prayer, and it passes unanimously. And it says this House, being deeply impressed with the apprehension of great dangers to be derived of British America from the hostile invasion of the city of Boston, sister colony of Massachusetts, deem it highly necessary that the said first day of June be set apart by the members of this House as a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, devoutly to implore divine interposition, and so on and so forth. Anyway, Washington writes in his diary, went to church, fasted all day. That was the day of the fasting. Well, the British crank it up, and they end up attacking Boston and the Battle of Bunker Hill. Do you know that the British brought the wrong size cannonballs? That's why we did so well at Bunker Hill. They were going to blast away and then send their troops up to clean up. Well, the cannonballs didn't fit, so they had to unload 2,500 troops and march them up the hill. They were repulsed 3 times, and 1,000 got killed. And anyway, so that's the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British finally evacuate Boston and go to New York. And so, New York Harbor fills up with the largest invasion force in world history. 32,000 troops, 400 ships. It looked like a forest of trees in the New York Harbor. And all Washington had was a bunch of ragtag guys that had only volunteered for 6 months, and then they're going to go back to their farm. He has just 20,000. And General William Livingston introduces in the Continental Congress a day of fasting and prayer. We earnestly recommend 17th of May, 1776, to be observed as a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. And it says, through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ, obtain pardon and forgiveness. Washington gets the order, and what? He orders his troops, the Continental Congress, having ordered Friday the 7th, to be observed as a day of fasting, that all officers and soldiers to pay strict obedience to the orders of the Continental Congress. Then they rush out a copy of the Declaration to George Washington. And the Declaration mentions God 4 times. Laws of nature, nature's God, bound by their creator, supreme judge of the world, and affirm reliance on the protection of divine providence. Well, what happens? Well, the British found a loyalist. Now, a loyalist is somebody that lives in America, but they're loyal to the enemy. I know it's hard for us to imagine that those type of people exist. Anyway, so this loyalist shows the British where to land upstream, and they march 10,000 British troops through Jamaica Pass to attack Washington from behind, who is on Brooklyn Heights. And Washington is facing the water. And on August 27th, he's attacked from behind. And here they are. They landed there, and they marched all night long while Washington was expecting the attack from this side. And so the British are fighting, and Washington watches the brave Maryland Regiment. These young guys charge 6 times, and they just get killed. They get charged until finally they're all dead. But they bought him time so that he could turn his army around. And he said, "Good God, what brave fellows I have lost this day." 3,000 Americans died, only 300 British. This was the largest battle of the entire Revolutionary War. And this was the entire American army. There was no other army that could come to the rescue. And by the end of the day, Washington is pinned up against the water with these 10,000 British coming down upon him with the harbor filled with 400 ships. I mean, the next day, the war will probably be over and we'll just be another British colony like Kenya or India. But instead, Washington has an idea. He decides to get every boat he can find and ferry his troops, his horses, his cannons, all his supplies across the East River to Manhattan Island. And providentially, it's very smooth water on the river, but out in the harbor where the British ships are, it's real turbulent. And as he's moving the troops and ordering everything in pitch black darkness, the sun begins to come up. And his chief of intelligence, Major Ben Talmadge, writes, as the dawn of the next day approached, those of us who remained in the trenches became very anxious for our own safety. And when the dawn appeared, there were several regiments still on duty. And there's the sun coming up. Now they're really in a pickle because they don't have enough left to fight, and the rest of them are stretched out as sitting ducks on the water. And so Major Ben Talmadge continues, at this time a very dense fog began to rise off the river, and it seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well, and so very dense was the atmosphere that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. We tarried until the sun had risen, but the fog remained as dense as ever. Well, Washington was on the last boat that left, and the fog lifts, and the British charge up the hill, and no one's there. This was the last chance they had to capture the entire American army all at once. And Washington writes, the hand of Providence has been so conspicuous in all this, the course of the war, that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith. But it will be time enough for me to turn preacher when my present appointment ceases. Then there's the Battle of Saratoga, and there was a settlement in north of New York in the forest, and it was a loyalist settlement. And David Jones lived there with it, and he had his fiancée, Jane McCrae, and they were about to get married, and the war starts, and so he kisses her goodbye, and he says, I'm going to join the British who landed in Canada, General Johnny Burgoyne, and we'll march back down and free the land from these rebels. And so they're coming down from Canada through north New York in the dense forest, and General Johnny Burgoyne had made a treaty with the Indians that they would terrorize and scalp the Americans. And it was so lopsided, they would have 30 Americans go out at nighttime on patrol, only 3 would come back, because these Indians would just lay in wait and kill them. Finally, as they get close to the settlement where David Jones had kissed his fiancée Jane McCrae goodbye, they're getting close, and of course he's probably feeling, a little anxious. And one night, the Indians come in after their scalping, and they have this nice, long, beautiful scalp of hair. And he recognizes that as his fiancée. Sure enough, they caught her, killed her, scalped her. They come into the camp, and it causes such an uproar that General Johnny Burgoyne has to meet with the Indians and tell them to tone it down. Well, the Indians only know on and off. They're either at peace or at war. They don't know this, limited warfare, like, you have one hand tied behind your back, like we make our troops do. And anyway, so the Indians get offended and leave. And now Burgoyne and his 6,000 men are in the middle of the New York forest, and they don't have a clue where they're at, where the Americans are at, and they get surrounded, and we win the Battle of Saratoga. 6,000 British troops are captured. Anyway, after that, matter of fact, this is the surrender of Burgoyne, and it is on a painting in our U.S. Capitol Rotunda. And Washington writes, I most devoutly congratulate my country and every well-wisher to the cause on this signal stroke of Providence. And then Congress has the first national day of Thanksgiving. And so this is after the Declaration. This is the first Thanksgiving. With one heart and one voice, join man in penitent confession of their manifold sins, that it may please God through the merits of Jesus Christ mercifully to forgive and blot them out, and under the providence of Almighty God, secure for these United States the greatest of all human blessings, independence and peace. Well, then they have the winter at Valley Forge, and meanwhile, there's Patrick Henry. He gave his "Give Me Liberty, Give Me Death" speech, and there was a young pastor named John Peter Muhlenberg that heard it. And then he decides that he's going to join. And he goes to Washington, and Washington makes him a colonel and says, go raise your men. So he goes back to his church and he preaches a sermon on Ecclesiastes. There's a time for all things, a time to gather stones, a time to scatter stones. He goes, there's a time to preach and a time to fight. And he takes off his clerical robe, and underneath he had the uniform of a continental soldier. And then he has an altar call, and 300 men of his church come up, and they answer to join, and they kiss their wives goodbye, and then ride off that afternoon, and they become the 8th Virginia Regiment, and they fight in all kinds of battles, including the Battle of Yorktown. He gets promoted to general, and then he's elected congressman, and then he's elected senator. and Pennsylvania put his statue in the U.S. Capitol, Statuary Hall, John Peter Muhlenberg. Anyway, another miracle. The hero of the Battle of Saratoga was Benedict Arnold. He led a charge that went around the flank, and it was successful. The only problem was his commanding officer had told him not to do it, but to wait in the back of the camp. And he got vindicated because it was a successful battle. He had his leg blown off, part of his leg. But anyway, so Benedict Arnold had his wife who felt like the Americans really did not appreciate her husband. And so she kept nagging, and she gets in contact with a British spy named John Andre. And so Benedict Arnold meets John Andre and agrees to betray West Point for the equivalent of $1 million. And West Point is on the Hudson River. And the Hudson River, that's where West Point is today, the Hudson River goes north and south, cutting New York in half, cutting America in half, with New England on one side and the middle southern colonies on the other side. So if you can control West Point, you can control the Hudson River, you can control the country. And Washington was planning on visiting West Point the very day that Benedict Arnold was going to betray it. And so the spy, John Andre, meets with Arnold, gets a map of West Point, and he's dressed as a civilian, and he's rummaging through the woods to get back to the British lines. And the Americans hear somebody rustling out there, and they catch him, and they say, "What are you doing out here?" And he's like, "Oh, just going for a walk." It's like, yeah, it doesn't sound right. So they search him once. They're still curious. They search him twice. They're still curious. They search him a third time, and they take off his boots, and in the heel of his boot, they find the map of West Point. So you know what they do? They arrest him, and they march him back into Benedict Arnold's office. Benedict Arnold gets the word that they're coming in. He flees, and he gets on a British ship called the Vulture. That was the name of the ship. He actually joins the British ranks, and he actually fights and kills Americans. And then the British never quite trust him after that anyway. And so Washington, so there he is, John Andre, and here he has his boot taken off, and there's the map of West Point. So Washington offers the British to do a prisoner exchange. You give us Benedict Arnold back, and we'll give you John Andre. The British say no, and we hang John Andre. And Washington writes this: "Treason of the blackest dye was yesterday discovered. General Arnold, who commanded at West Point, was about to give the American cause a deadly wound, if not fatal stab. Happily, the treason had been timely discovered to prevent the fatal misfortune. The providential train of circumstances which led to its discovery affords the most convincing proof that the liberties of America are the object of divine protection." So so Ezra Stiles, the president of Yale, says, "A providential miracle at the last minute detected the treacherous scheme of traitor Benedict Arnold, which would have delivered the American army, including George Washington himself, into the hands of the enemy." And so Continental Congress has another day of Thanksgiving, and they write, "The late remarkable interposition of his watchful providence in rescuing the person of our commander-in-chief and army from imminent dangers at the moment when treason was ripened for execution, it is therefore recommended a day of public thanksgiving and prayer to confess our unworthiness and offer fervent supplications to God of all grace to cause the knowledge of Christianity to spread over all the earth." And so another miracle is the Battle of Cow Pens. You have some cows, you put them in a pen, so it's called Cow Pens. It's in North Carolina. And our American general is Daniel Morgan. And he has some ragtag American militia. And he talks them into firing 3 shots before they get scared and run away. And so he lines them up with a river behind them. Now, if you're ever fighting a battle, you never fight with the river behind you. Because if you're losing, it makes it very difficult to run away. And so this looked bad. Well, the British have their Colonel Tarleton. He's called the Butcher because he would kill innocent people. And he had the dragoons, these great big horses and these swords that are like razor blades. And he is, they would charge like 30 miles an hour. So this is the fastest thing on the battlefield. This is like, F-16s at the time. So, Colonel Tarleton is riding along. He sees this militia with the river behind him. He says, "What fools." He decides to charge. The Americans fire once, boom, and then they reload. They fire twice, boom. They fire a third time, boom. And by this time, the British are at a full gallop, and the Americans run over the hill. The British fly over the hill, only to be met at point-blank range by 400 crack, battle-hardened American Continental soldiers that had been hiding. And they fire, boom, 100 British dragoons are killed instantly, and 800 of them throw down their arms and surrender, and Tarleton hightails it out of there. And so we capture them. It's a great victory. Now Cornwallis, the commanding general, is furious. And so he sets out after General Daniel Morgan and Nathaniel Greene. And so Daniel Morgan, Nathaniel Greene, they retreat, and Cornwallis is chasing him, and he is leaving extra equipment that would slow him down. He's burning it, he's trashing it, leaving behind cannons, leaving behind wagons full of supplies, because he wants to get his men back. And the Americans cross the Catawba River. About an hour later, the British show up, but before they can start crossing, there's a flash flood, and the river rises over its banks, and they have to wait a day before they can cross. Then the British get to the Americans cross the Yadkin River, and the British show up shortly after, and another flash flood, and the rivers rise, and so the red coats is the red, and the blue coats is Daniel Morgan and Nathaniel Greene. And finally, they get to the Dan River around 1 o'clock in the morning. And the British are watching the Americans getting out the other side. But before they can start crossing, another flash flood, and they have to give up the chase. And so, British Commander Henry Clinton writes, "Here the Royal Army was again stopped by a sudden rise of the waters, which had only just fallen almost miraculously to let the enemy over, who could not else have eluded Lord Cornwallis's grasp, so close was he at their rear." Now, Cornwallis has an army with no supplies because he had trashed them. And so Cornwallis is ordered to wait at Yorktown. And Washington, by the way, says, "We have abundant reasons to thank Providence for its many favorable interpositions in our behalf. It has been at times my only dependence, for all of the resources seem to have failed us." Well, they're waiting at Yorktown for British ships, and the French have Louis XVI finally send his navy. It blocks the British from Cornwallis's rescue, and the Americans force Cornwallis to surrender, and the war is over. And Washington says, "To diffuse the general joy through every breast, the general orders divine services to be performed tomorrow in the several brigades. The commander-in-chief earnestly recommends troops not on duty should universally attend with that gratitude of heart which the recognition of such astonishing interposition of Providence demands." John Jay, the first Chief Justice, "This glorious revolution is distinguished by so many marks of divine favor and interposition that no doubt can remain of it being supported in a manner so singular, and I may say miraculous, that when future ages read its history, they will be tempted to consider a great part of it as fabulous, as made up." So America broke away from the most powerful monarch that planet Earth had ever seen. And if it wasn't for a 3,000-mile ocean, if it wasn't for the second biggest world power giving them a run for their money, and if it wasn't for America having 2 centuries of practice of self-government, sort of like training wheels, right? Because the chessboard was Europe, and America was an afterthought. And so the colonies in America got the chance to practice doing self-government. And so when they got rid of the king, they were able to maintain order because they had Judeo-Christian morality. I give a whole talk on it, but it's a spectrum of power. One side is total government, the other side is no government. Total government side, power like a black hole sucks into the hands of a dictator. No government side's anarchy. So it only works with no government if the people have lots of virtue. So Israel, they were able to maintain their freedom as long as the priests taught the law. They had lots of virtue, right? But when they gave up their virtue, there was more crisis and crime, and the people say, government restore order, and the government has to concentrate power to do it, and then they're back with the dictator. And so America, we went from the concentrated power of the king, we separated it, but we had 98% of Americans were Protestant. A little less than 2% Catholic. Catholics were only allowed in 3 colonies, New York, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, and they didn't even have full rights in those. And there was only 7 synagogues in the whole country, 1,500 Jews in a country of 3 million. And so the country was a Judeo-Christian country. And so I read through every state constitution. I found it interesting. From 1776 to 1790, 9 states required their office holders to be Protestant Christians. 3 states were a little more liberal. Maryland said all you had to do was be a Christian to hold state office. And that was pretty liberal because, you know, by saying Christian, you could be any denomination of Protestant and even Catholic. Delaware, in its original state constitution, said all you had to do was believe in the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Ben Franklin signed Pennsylvania's 1776 Constitution, which said every office holder had to make a declaration of belief in God and acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. Now, the most liberal state was the most evangelical, Rhode Island, founded by Baptists, and they had 0 religious requirements to hold state office. They thought that if you required someone to be a Christian, if they weren't and they said they were, that would be hypocritical, right? If they wanted to get elected, I mean, could you imagine someone saying they're Christian just to get elected? Anyway, then there was an Irish potato famine in 1846. Millions of Irish Catholics came to America. The Catholic percent went from 2% to 20%. Then there was a persecution of Jews in Bavaria, and about 250,000 Jews come over. They go from 0.1% to 2%. And you drop the pebble in the pond, the ripples go out. But this is the country. So we were able to get by without a strong king because the people had these internal morals where they're taught, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And there's a God watching you that wants you to be nice. Right? So it's not a Sharia God that says, I want you to subdue the infidel wherever you're at. It's a Judeo-Christian God that says, be nice to the stranger because you want a stranger in Egypt. You know, do unto others. Anyway, does that make sense? Are you still with me? So out of these 6,000 years, we were able to break away from a king, separate the power, and instead of having anarchy, since the people had morals, we were able to have the freest, most prosperous country with the most individual liberty and freedom that any nation had ever had in the previous 6,000 years. But as we give up our morality and we say, give in to your passions and lusts, then there's more crime. And then the response is, government, you got to step in to stop the crime. And the government does it by taking away our rights and concentrating power. And anyway, Ben Franklin is at the Constitutional Convention. He says, in the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. Treaty of Paris is signed, and it starts off in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity and so forth. Ronald Reagan said, in 1775, the Continental Congress proclaimed the first National Day of Prayer. 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the long, weary Revolutionary War, during which a National Day of Prayer had been proclaimed every spring for 8 years. And this is one of the books where I go through all those stories. So, we had a revolution, and we had what's called the Second Great Awakening Revival. Well, France decided to have a revolution, but they had a couple years where the crops failed, and the people didn't have food. And of course, when they told Queen Marie Antoinette that the people didn't have bread, she said, let them eat cake. Wasn't her fault. She was just 20 years old, raised in court. She didn't know what was going on. And but the people in France said, gee, we have this problem. If we can just chop off the king and queen's heads, all of our problems will be solved. So they bring them into the streets of Paris, chop off their heads, and their situation does not turn around. And so then they decide they're going to chop off the heads of all the royalty. And they bring them into the streets of Paris, chop off their heads, and their situation still doesn't turn around. Then they decide they're going to chop off the heads of all the wealthy. We don't have money, they have money, they must be evil. They bring them into the streets of Paris, chop off their heads, their situation still doesn't turn around. Then they decide it's the businessmen and farmers. We don't have food and stuff. They have food and stuff. They must be selfish and evil. They bring them into the streets of Paris, chop off their heads, and their situation still doesn't turn around. Then they decide it's the hoarders, the people that have food stored up in their house. We don't have food. They have food. They're selfish. And so they brought them in, chopped their heads off. And then they decide it's the clergy, because they're speaking out against all the head chopping off stuff. They're somehow holding us back from this new utopia. They get brought in and chop their heads off. Then they decide it's the former revolutionaries, the ones who used to chop off heads but got tired of it. They're somehow to blame. They bring them into the streets of Paris. 40,000 heads were chopped off in Paris. And if that wasn't bad enough, they decided to close all the churches. They didn't want a constitution that says done in the year of the Lord, 1787, like ours. So they made 1791 the new year one. They didn't want a 7-day week with a Sabbath rest. They came up with a 10-day week. And matter of fact, they even had a 10-hour clock. 10 hours daylight, 10 hours nighttime. And they had 100 seconds to the minute and 100 minutes to the hour. And they said 10 was the number of man, 10 fingers and 10 toes. And so this was a deifying of man, right? Humanism. And so they came up with the metric system. Everything divisible by 10. Maybe that's why I never liked the metric system. Anyway, they decided that destroy all religious monuments. Robespierre, who was the head of their Homeland Security, they call it Committee on Public Safety, he said terror is nothing more than swift and dominable justice. And he actually gave a speech justifying that terror is useful to get all the people in the country to go along with this new secular government. And so he puts a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral, covers her with a sheet, and said, this is the goddess of reason, let's worship her. And they desecrate the graves, even the graves of Saint Genevieve, who, when Attila the Hun was scourging Europe in 451 AD, Attila the Hun had 500,000 warriors, and they would just eat up anything in their path, and they were headed toward Paris. And this little Saint Genevieve gets everybody to fast and pray, and for some reason, Attila turns aside, and the city is spared. So she's like the patron saint of Paris. And so during this French Revolution, they dig up the bones of Saint Genevieve and trash them. The crosses are forbidden. Public and private worship outlawed. This is like the ACLU on steroids. The church education outlawed. Priests and ministers and those who harbored them were executed on sight. Very similar to what happened in Mexico in 1917. Anyway, so then they went to the Vendée, which is a northwest area of France, very Christian, very Catholic. And the religious people there didn't want to have their conscience forced by this secular government. And so they were resisting it. And so the secular government sent their army up there, and they killed 300,000 men, women, and children. Napoleon claimed to be sick, so he didn't participate in the butchery. And during this time, the French privateers ignored all the treaties with America. They captured 300 American ships, and they imprisoned our sailors. They demanded, Talleyrand was their foreign minister, Talleyrand demanded money under the table, and the cry went out across America, millions for defense, but not a cent for tribute. So in America, our president is John Adams. John Adams talked George Washington into being the commander of our troops again. Now, Washington is retired at Mount Vernon. It's the year before he dies. And he writes back saying, seeing that the cup of reconciliation has been drained to the last drop and that war is the only answer, I'll agree. But if at all possible, I'd like to command from Mount Vernon. So this is like those of you that fought in World War II or the Korean War, and you're being called up again. And so Washington's like, okay, I'll do it. Anyway, John Adams, the president, has a day of fasting. 98 and 1799, as the people of the United States are still held in jeopardy by the insidious acts of a foreign nation, as well as by the dissemination among them of those principles subversive to all the foundations of all religious, moral, and social obligations, I hereby recommend a day of solemn humiliation, fasting, and prayer, that the citizens call to mind our numerous offenses against the Most High God, implore the pardoning mercy through the great mediator and Redeemer, through the grace of his Holy Spirit, righteousness exalteth the nation, sin is a reproach to any people, and the prayer must have worked, because war with France was averted. Anyway, so in America, we have a second Great Awakening revival sweeping across. So in France, where they're chopping off heads, We have Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian revival meetings, camp meeting revivals. There's the universities being formed for preachers to teach them to go out and evangelize the Indians. And then we have the Barbary Pirate War. So I mentioned about Islam and how they would capture people, and how there were entire Catholic orders in Europe. Well, it got to the place where each country would pay an annual tribute. And when America got our independence, we were no longer covered by the British tribute. So Jefferson is an ambassador in France. He meets with the Abdrahman, the Muslim ambassador of Tripoli. And he asks him, "What have we done to offend you?" And the guy said, "Nothing. It is written in the laws of the prophet that all nations who do not acknowledge Islam's authority are sinners, and it's our duty to take them captive. And any Mussulman who shall be slain shall surely go to paradise." All right? And so, so here we are today thinking, what did the West do to offend them? Mike showed me an article that says, oh, it's the colonialism, that's what stirred them up. No, it's written in their Quran that all nations that not acknowledge it. Anyway, so Jefferson gets fed up with us paying 20% of our federal budget to these Muslim pirates. And Jefferson spent 18 months trying to ransom 300 Americans that were captured and stuck in the dungeons of Algiers. And when he gets to be the third president, he gets fed up and sends in our Marines. And that's where we get the Marine anthem, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. And so we send our troops over there. I wrote a whole book and have several DVDs that go through the history of Islam, but just giving you a quick nutshell. Muhammad started his faith in the year 622 AD. That's called the Flight, the Hijra. He starts off 12 years earlier as a religious leader in Mecca. And he only makes 70 converts in 12 years. And he gets a little aggressive, and he gets chased out of town. And so he flees north 210 miles to Medina. It was a Jewish city. 3 Jewish tribes control Medina. They were nice enough to let Muhammad in as a religious refugee. They reject his faith, and so Muhammad goes into the minority neighborhoods in Medina, and he begins to get a little following. He's sort of like, organizing in the community, to use a term we're familiar with. And he goes back to the Jewish leaders of the city, and he presents himself as a candidate of change. And he says, I'm a newcomer to the city. I can rise above your tribal partisanship. And the Jews make a treaty with Muhammad, and now he is a political leader in addition to being a religious leader. Then something happens. His followers in Mecca get a little pushy, argumentative, and threatening, the way some of his followers are today. They get chased out of town for disturbing the peace. They go north to Medina, and Muhammad permits his followers to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing them out of town. So where Jesus said, if they take your coat, give them your shirt, Muhammad said, if they take your house, you retaliate, take their caravan. So Muhammad got a whole chapter of the Quran, chapter 8, Surah 8, on how to distribute booty from robbing caravans. And he gets a fifth of the booty. That was his portion. And so the Meccans send 1,000 soldiers to protect their caravan, and Muhammad, with 300 warriors, defeats 1,000. This amazing victory convinces Muhammad to be a military leader. And he fights in 66 battles and raids in the next 8 years before he dies. He even used the catapult when he attacked a city called Al-Taif. And when he was told the catapult was killing women and children, his response was, they are among them. So they got to be killed too. So suicide bombers today say it's okay to kill innocent women and children to advance Islam because Muhammad did at Al-Taif. And since Muhammad is the perfect Muslim, Muslims today that want to be better Muslims, they want to be like Muhammad religiously, politically, and militarily. So there's freedom for all religions in America, but Islam is not just a religion because Muhammad was not just a religious leader. He was a political and a military leader. And since he's the perfect Muslim, he's the one that they want to be like, religiously, politically, and militarily. Anyway, so there's 1,400 years of religious, political, military conquest. And this is all that was conquered within 23 years of Muhammad's death. They conquered Yemen, which was a Jewish kingdom. Gassanids were Arab Christians. Jerusalem had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine. Syria was the first country completely Christian. Armenia was Christian. Egypt had been Christian, evangelized by Mark that wrote the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They went into Persia. 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa wiped out. Then they invaded Spain, Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, Rhodes, Crete. And it was the largest political, military, religious empire in the world. And then where Muhammad robbed caravans, on sea they would rob ships. And so that's the Barbary Pirate War. These are those Catholic orders that would ransom. There's the stolen village of Baltimore, Ireland. And here is Captain William Bainbridge borrowing 80,000 guilders from the Dutch and delivering them to the Dey of Algiers, the leader of Algiers. And anyway, so there we have the Barbary Pirate Wars, and Stephen Decatur fights. Francis Scott Key, when the Barbary Pirate Wars ended, he is an attorney in Baltimore, and he writes a song. And this is 9 years before he writes the Star-Spangled Banner. And he writes it to the same tune that 9 years later he would write the Star-Spangled Banner to. So I'm going to read it with you. In conflict resistless, each toil they endured till their foes shrunk dismayed from the war's desolation. And pale beamed the crescent, its splendor obscured by the light of the star-spangled flag of our nation, where each flaming star gleamed a meteor of war, and the turbaned head bowed to the terrible glare, that mixed with the olive the laurel shall wave and form a bright wreath for the brow of the brave. You can see some hints of the song he'll write 9 years later. Anyway, so are you still with me? I know we're getting a little feedback, and I don't know if I'm standing in the wrong spot or something. But so France, all the head chopping off stuff, total chaos. They finally get a dictator named Napoleon. He invades Italy, captures the Pope. He invades Spain and puts his brother Joseph on the throne. That's when Mexico breaks away from Spain. The Spaniards in Mexico are like, why be loyal to a Spanish throne with a French guy on top? And then Napoleon needs money for his military campaign, and France spent 10 years and probably 100,000 troops, Polish troops, I mean, all kinds of troops trying to put down a slave rebellion in Haiti. And because they could not put down a slave rebellion in one island, Napoleon thought there's no way we could put a slave rebellion down in the whole Louisiana territory, so I'm going to cut my losses, sell the whole Louisiana territory, get some money so I can do my military campaigns in Europe. And so what does he do? He sells and doubles the size of the United States. It is the largest real estate deal in world history, like 1 million acres at 15 cents a piece. So Napoleon conquers all Prussia, and he conquers all Belgium, and so now he's got the Spanish Navy and the French Navy combined, and he's going to invade England. And the English have Horatio Nelson, and he defeats Napoleon at the Battle of Trafalgar. Once Napoleon is defeated, the British have the undisputed, most powerful navy in the world. What do they decide to do with their navy? Send it to America, of course. And so the president is James Madison. He has a day of prayer. I do recommend rendering the sovereign of the universe public homage. And so the British send a squadron to Lake Erie. And they have Robert Barclay, their one-armed captain, who had his arm blown off fighting Napoleon. And he has long-range cannons. Well, we, America, have 28-year-old Captain Oliver Hazard Perry. Most of his crew are free blacks from Ohio. And they built this ship, and they had to put it in the bay at Put-in-Bay, Ohio. In other words, they had to put it in the water and then drag it across a sandbar to get it out in there. And they end up confronting the British. The British use their long-range cannons and splinter Oliver Hazard Perry's flagship to pieces. They expect him to raise the flag and surrender. Instead, this gutsy young guy gets on a rowboat with some of his crew, and he rows over to the second in command ship, the Niagara. And by this time, the wind changes directions. And Oliver Hazard Perry sails his ship, the Niagara, directly across the front of all of the British ships, firing every cannon away like a madman. He gets to the other side, the smoke clears, he had disabled the entire British squadron. Never before had an entire British squadron been disabled at one time. This allowed us to take back Detroit and all the Northwest Territory. Oliver Hazard Perry exclaimed to the men on deck, "The prayers of my wife are answered." He writes to the Secretary of Navy, "It has pleased the Almighty to give the arms of the United States a signal victory over their enemies on this lake. The British squadron, consisting of 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, 1 sloop, have this moment surrendered to the force of my command after a sharp conflict." The President, James Madison, writes, "It has pleased the Almighty to bless our arms on Lake Erie, the squadron under the command of Captain Perry, having met the British squadron of superior force, a sanguinary conflict ended in the capture of the whole." And so we see that Madison has another day of prayer. Napoleon, what's he up to? Well, now that his navy is defeated, he is landlocked. And I'm going to move just a little bit, seeing if I can get that little ringing to stop. So, sounds like I might have found a better spot. Can you still see it okay? So, Napoleon invades Russia with 500,000 men. And they burn all the fields in front of him. And has a battle where like 100,000 die. Napoleon gets to Moscow, and the Russians evacuate and take all their food and burn a whole bunch of it and leave. And so Napoleon wanders around Moscow for a while, waiting for somebody to come and surrender to him. And nobody does. And winter starts to set in. And so instead of taking a different way back, he could have found food. Instead, he retraces his steps. And he goes along that same burnt out area where there's no food. And so his men are like dragging and starving. And then the winter blizzard hits, and then the Russians attack. And they do their hit and run and hit and run. Napoleon finally gets to the Berezina River. And he has a makeshift bridge, and he crosses with his officers. All of a sudden, the Russians show up, blow up the bridge. And Napoleon watches his 500,000 men getting butchered to pieces on the other side of the river. And then he finally goes back into Europe with 50,000. In 6 months, marches in with 500,000, comes out with 50,000. So he has to abdicate the throne, step down, and he's banished to the island of Elba. And so, what do the British do now that they have an army at their disposal? The British decide to send their army to America. And so, they march toward Washington, D.C. Again, this is the most powerful military. They stood up to Napoleon here. And so, Dolly Madison takes the painting of George Washington off the mantle of the fireplace, and she is riding out of town on a carriage while Admiral George Cockburn is riding into town. And British Admiral George Cockburn goes up to the White House, goes inside, sees they were about to have dinner. He sits down, eats dinner, and then torches the place. And then he goes to the Capitol, the congressman. He has his soldiers sit in the chairs of our congressmen. He goes to the speaker's chair, and he says, "Who votes to burn the Capitol?" And they all say, "Aye." And so they burn our Capitol. And then they burn the Treasury, the Patent Office, the Library of Congress, the Navy Yard. And then the sky gets dark, and the winds pick up to a frightening roar, and lightning begins striking at the British soldiers. And a tornado touches down, knocking off roofs and chimneys on the British, picking up British cannons, throwing them yards away. Admiral, and it slaps horse and rider to the ground, just whap. And so the book Washington Weather recorded British Admiral George Cockburn exclaiming to a lady, "Great God, madame, is this the kind of storm to which you are accustomed to in this infernal country?" To which the lady replied, "No, sir, this is a special interposition of Providence to drive our enemies from our city." Well, the rains come and extinguish the fires. 2 British ships were blown ashore, and one British historian writes, "More British soldiers were killed by this stroke of nature than by all the firearms the American troops had mustered in the feeble defense of their city. This was a miracle in American history. And so the president, James Madison, says, okay, God, you got our attention. He declares a day of fasting and prayer. Now, why is this significant? Madison is the one who introduced the First Amendment in the first session of Congress. If anybody had a clue what it meant, he would. And here he's president, and he's declaring days of fasting. He says, the two houses of the national legislature express their desire that in the present time of public calamity and war, a day may be recommended to be observed by the people of the United States as a day of public humiliation, fasting, and prayer to Almighty God, His blessings on their arm and a speedy restoration of peace. Anyway, of confessing their sins. You know, you think of it, you wonder if the government today could even identify as sin. Maybe not recycling? I don't know. Transgressions and so forth. He would graciously be pleased to pardon their offenses and the adoration of the great sovereign of the universe. So, the British leave Washington, D.C., and they go to Baltimore, the third biggest city in America. And they fire away 1,800 cannonballs nonstop for 25 hours. And that storm system that was over Washington, D.C., moved over Baltimore and dumped so much rain that Fort McHenry is an earthen fort. And so the mud got so soft, most of those cannonballs sank in the mud. And Francis Scott Key, who was a lawyer in Baltimore doing a prisoner exchange, and he was on a British ship, sees the flag still waving, and so he writes the Star-Spangled Banner. And let's read this fourth verse. See if you can see some similarities to what we read before. Oh, thus be it ever when free men shall stand between their love and home and the war's desolation. Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that has made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust, and the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. That phrase, in God we trust, got so popular that Lincoln put it on our coins, and it became our official national anthem. Well, the war wasn't over, though. The British had let out a rumor that they would pay in gold for American scalps. And so not too far from Florida is Fort Mims, Alabama. And the Red Stick Creek Indians decided to massacre 500 men, women, and children to get their scalps. And so we see there's Fort Mims. Here are the Creek Indians in 1813-14 took place, the most brutal massacre in American history and so forth. So Andrew Jackson is sent down there, and he defeats the Creek Indians at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and then Andrew Jackson is sent to New Orleans. And while he's in New Orleans, the war ends. It's December 1814. The Treaty of Ghent, G-H-E-N-T, is signed in Belgium, but nobody has a telephone to call New Orleans. And so in January of 1815, 10,000 British troops are marching across a field under cover of fog toward an abandoned canal, a ditch. And on the other side of the ditch is Andrew Jackson with his Kentucky and Tennessee sharpshooters and Jean Lafitte, the French pirate from the Gulf of Mexico. Right before the British get there, the fog lifts. And the Americans are like, bam, and they kill the British officers. And now the British soldiers don't know, are they supposed to go forward, are they supposed to go back? And they stand in the middle of the field for 30 minutes, 2,000 are killed. Only 8 Americans. 2,008? This was miraculous. And so here's the field, and there's the ditch, and so this is a good rendering of it. You can see how close they were, and all of a sudden that fog lifts. And so Andrew Jackson writes, "It appears the unerring hand of Providence shielded my men from the shower of balls, bombs, and rockets when every ball, bomb from our guns carried with them a mission of death." Andrew Jackson writes, "I was sure of success, for I knew that God would not give me previsions of disaster, but signs of victory. He said, this ditch can never be passed, it cannot be done." If you've been to New Orleans, there's the big Catholic church, and the pastor there tells the story of Andrew Jackson going into the church the day before the battle and praying and saying that the Lord had given him previsions of victory, And anyway, Andrew Jackson writes, "Heaven, to be sure, has interposed most wonderfully in our behalf. I'm filled with gratitude when I look back at what we have escaped." So, ladies and gentlemen, we have story after story after story of our country being in crises and men and women praying. Talking about the bank war, where Nicholas Biddle had more money than the country, and he was then an assassination takes place on Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, "A kind providence has shielded me against the recent attempt on my life. Irresistibly carry many minds to the belief in a superintending providence." And a couple more books I wrote. And cholera. Did you know in 1849, 150,000 Americans died of cholera? Came from India, where a certain group of people would bathe in the sewage-filled Ganges River. And when the British took over India and put in railroads and steamboats, now somebody infected with cholera could quickly go back to Europe. Tens of millions died in the early 1800s, all through the 1800s, but in Paris and in London and Berlin. And then they came to America. Thousands died in New York, New Orleans. 6,000 died in St. Louis. Tchaikovsky died of cholera at this time. Harriet Beecher Stowe's son died of cholera. James K. Polk, the former president, died of cholera. And then the 1849 California gold rush starts. 12,000 people died of cholera going out west because somebody infected the water hole. And so the president is Zachary Taylor, and he has a day of fasting and prayer, and by the end of the month, the death rate stopped. And anyway, I could go on. Woodrow Wilson had a day of fasting and prayer in World War I, 1918. Humbly to acknowledge our dependence on Almighty God, exhort fellow citizens of all faiths to pray that God would forgive our sins. And then a story that I can't help but share. 1918, American battalion pinned down along the Decauville rail line north of Châtel-Chery, France. Sergeant Alvin C. York described, "The Germans got us. They stopped us dead in our tracks. Their machine guns were up there on the heights overlooking us, well hidden. We couldn't tell for certain where the heavy fire was coming from. Those machine guns were spitting fire, cutting down undergrowth all around me. All but 8 of his squadron were killed. Sergeant York takes control. He takes out 32 machine guns, kills 28 of the enemy, and captures 132 of them. And he gets awarded the Medal of Honor." I mean, he is from Kentucky, and he grew up hunting in the woods. And he said when they were all killed, he was down there on the ground, and he would pick them off. And then he says, and his story was printed in the Washington Post, like in 1929. And he says, "I shoot better standing up." So I stood there, and they said that they were in a ditch on the ridge, but they would have to lift their head up to see where he's at. And he says the very second they would lift their head up, he'd go boom. Another one lift their head, boom. Another one, boom, boom, boom. 32 of them, they kept getting a little peek where it's at, they get shot. Finally, and then he gets charged. There's some Germans in a ditch behind him, and they put their bayonets on, and they're charging at him. And so he whips around with his pistol, and he goes, when we would turkey hunt, and they start charging you, you shoot the last one first, because if you shoot the first one, the other ones will turn around. So he said, I shot the last one, then the second last one, the third one, then finally he had 6 bullets in his gun, and there were 6 guys charging him. And then he turns back around, he picks off some more. Finally, the German commander raises a white flag. And he comes down his surrenders, and Sergeant York makes them drop all their guns. And the German says, "How many of you are there?" And he goes, "Enough." And out of the woods comes 7 other guys. And so there's 8 of them. And here they are marching 132 captured down the road to the American side. And just an amazing story. Anyway, he has his story printed in the Washington Post. He says, "Some of them officers been saying that I, being a mountain boy and accustomed to woods, done all these things right just by instinct. I hadn't never got much larnin' from books except the Bible. Maybe my instincts are more natural, but that ain't enough to account for the way I come out alive. With all those German soldiers raining death on me, I'm a-telling you, the hand of God must have been in that fight. Just think of them 30 machine guns raining fire on me, point-blank range, only 25 yards, and then all them there rifles and pistols, those bombs. And then those men charged me with fixed bayonets, and I never received a scratch. And bringing 132 prisoners, I've got only one explanation, that God must have heard my prayers."
Wow. Amen.
God, that our founders acknowledged, I believe is still there. And they faced terrible crises. And they had faith, and they had courage, and things turned around. So here we are today, facing some terrible crises, but it's our turn to have faith and have courage and see things turn around. So thank you so much. God bless you.